Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Bill Hirsch, the Capital Grants and Loans Administrator at the Maryland Historic Trust. You're all attending the Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program General Overview webinar, and you can find a PDF of this presentation with usable links on our website. We would like to thank you for joining us for this webinar for our newest grant round. First, I want to guide you to our website where you can find more information on the grant program and the link to the application portal. On the right side of this page, you can learn about the program's webinar workshop schedule, where there is a link to register for upcoming workshops and webinars. On the left side of the page, you can click on the Guidelines and Resources link to access grant application documents. This is the page where you can access application materials. They're located under the heading For Grant Applicants. The links include the grant guidelines, a sample grant application, a budget template with instructions, the photograph template, the property owner consent template, the application quick start guide, and the Department of Natural Resources project information form, which you're only going to need if you're applying for a grant on land owned by DNR. If that's the case, you'll need to fill out this form and return it to your park manager. MHT does not review this form, and it doesn't need to be included in your application. As I mentioned before, the slides from today's webinar are available for download on our website, and our previously recorded webinars can be viewed on MHT's YouTube channel. This website is also where you can access the My Grant Account portal, where you'll submit your online grant application when it comes time. Please be aware that MHT's grants management system is in the middle of an update, and some programs, but not all, will be using the new system. This year's Historic Preservation Capital Grant Program will be the first to use the new system, and the links to the FY25 application will prompt you to create a new account in that system. All applicants, even those who have a current account, will need to register as a new user. You will not be able to use your previous name, username, and password. If you are an existing awardee or a previous applicant and you wish to view an application that you submitted during prior years, you will still be able to access that information through the current portal, which will be available via the My Grant Account button on the homepage using your current username and password. If you need assistance, please reach out to your project monitor. Everything we'll go over today and more will be in the grant guidelines. Today, we're going to be going over the eligibility of applicants, properties and project types, the competitiveness of your application, how to get started on your application, how to best describe your project, what you're going to need for filling out your budget spreadsheet, the internal grant administration process once you've submitted your application, and the criteria used to evaluate and select the awarded grants. So a little about the program. At its basic level, this grant program funds capital or construction-related projects for historic properties. It is a highly competitive grant program due to a limited allocation amount of only $600,000 a year. To give you an idea of how competitive that is, last round we had over $3.1 million in requested funds. The maximum grant amount available is $100,000 for each awardee, and there is a suggested minimum grant amount of $10,000, but we will accept smaller amounts in certain cases. Don't be afraid to ask for the full $100,000 if that's what you think your project needs to be completed. Always ask for a little bit more than you think is needed. It will likely get used, or you can always return any unused funds. Asking for the maximum or minimum grant amount does not make you any more or any less competitive. The application will be live on our program website starting the morning of Monday, February 3rd. You can access this through the My Grant Account portal. The application is due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, March 17th. Please submit your application as early as possible so that we can help you resolve any issues you might encounter before the application deadline. MHT staff are not in the office or checking emails the night the application is due, so if there are technical issues at midnight prohibiting you from applying, please email us explaining the issues so we can try to help after the deadline. If we notice issues with your application during our threshold review, we will reach out at that time. On the next few slides, we're going to go over the eligibility requirements of the program. If you're considering applying to the grant program, the first step is to determine if you, as an applicant, your historic property, and your project are eligible. Please reach out to us for a grant program eligibility determination if you're unsure about your eligibility status. So who can apply? Basically, anyone is eligible to apply for funding. This includes nonprofits, local governments, business entities, private individuals, and state and federal agencies. If you're a past applicant or past or current awardee, there are no restrictions on reapplying every year. Even though anyone can apply, there are some restrictions on the types of applicants, which I'll go into next. Nonprofit organizations and businesses must be registered with the State Department of Assessments and Taxations, also known as SDAT, and listed in good standing with the state to be considered eligible. Please check this website for your organization or business if you intend to apply. There is time between now and March 17th to get in good standing with SDAT if you aren't already. And just as a reminder, the links from this presentation are found in the grant guidelines and webinar slides on the program website. Nonprofits must submit proof of their nonprofit status with an IRS determination letter, or at least proof of an application in process with the IRS. However, having an application for an IRS determination in process may not make you as competitive as a nonprofit that already has a current IRS determination. If you apply as a nonprofit, you cannot be awarded grant funds without this proof. For churches and fraternal organizations, your proof may be your IRS umbrella letter if you are a branch of another organization. Please get in touch with us if you're not sure what either of these documents are. State and federal government agencies must apply as nonprofits. If you're applying for a project on DNR lands, please see the DNR project information form on our website for more information. Even though private property owners and businesses are eligible applicants under the program, they often are not a good fit. Since the program selection criteria favors nonprofits and local governments, homeowners and businesses often struggle with being competitive when it comes to meeting the public benefit and educational requirements of the program. If you're a homeowner looking for financial assistance to do repairs on your home, and you don't plan to provide a public educational or public benefit component to your project, I recommend that you get in touch with us so that we can provide you with information on other resources. So now let's talk about what an eligible property actually is. Eligible properties are limited to those that are listed in or determined eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, which is also known as the NRHP, either individually or as a contributing restructure within a district, or is already listed as a National Historic Landmark. This is a regulatory requirement, and eligibility is determined by our National Register specialists. Please reach out to us for determination of NRHP eligibility if you need it. It will be very helpful for our specialists if you include photographs of the building, along with any information you might have on its historical significance. As a public resource, MHT manages an online database of historic and historic age properties, the Medusa Cultural Resource Information System. Medusa allows you to look up your property by address and may contain information concerning your property's historic name, as well as a historic context or architectural description of the property. Please note that your property may not have been surveyed yet and may not be found on the database. You can input your property's address in the address bar located on the top of the map screen. And if your property has been previously surveyed or is located within the boundary of a district that has been surveyed, you will be able to click the small MIHP icon under the type heading at the left of the screen. There are additional layers that can be toggled off, so feel free to explore the database and the information that it provides. Clicking on the small icon I just mentioned will pull up any information that's been developed for the property, including a scanned inventory form that can be accessed by clicking on the Open Scanned Inventory Form link. The inventory form often contains a wealth of information about your property, including photographs, a historic context, and sometimes even maps of the site. In the related record section of the MIHP record, you can see if your property has already been determined eligible for the NRHP or is already listed in the NRHP. Again, if no records for your property exist or the MIHP form for your property does not list any prior determinations, please contact your project monitor. There are a wide variety of historic property types that can be eligible for the grant, including houses, mills, churches, ships, general stores, barns, schools, lighthouses, and archaeological sites. MHT loves to see applications on a diverse type of properties and histories. As part of meeting the property eligibility requirements of the program, MHT must have consent from the property owner to do the project and their willingness to convey an easement. A property owner consent letter template is available on the program website to download. It must be signed by the legal property owner and submitted with the application. If you don't have this letter, your application will not be considered. Even if the applicant is the owner and even if your property already has an easement with MHT, you must still submit this letter. MHT will use the property listing in SDAT to confirm the name of the property owner, and then they will compare that information with what is provided in the property owner consent letter. If MHT cannot find your property on the SDAT website or the information does not match what you've provided, your application may not be considered for funding. Please check before you submit your application to make sure there are no issues. So there are three broad categories of eligible activities: acquisition, restoration, rehabilitation, and pre-development. All activities are construction related and should preserve the historic features and materials of the property. Only nonprofit and local governments can apply for pre-development funding. For an acquisition grant, the acquisition of the property must directly contribute to its preservation and protection of the property. Think about how your organization acquiring the property will help to preserve it. For example, the archaeological quarry site pictured here was slated for development. To save it, it was acquired by an archaeological conservancy, which is partially funded by this grant program. We've only funded one acquisition grant since this program relaunched in 2018. If you're applying for an acquisition grant, please know that this is a really tricky type of grant to be awarded. Timing and finances must align perfectly, which is really difficult to do when it comes to real estate timelines and MHT's grant administration timeline. Acquisition grant applications can also request funds for restoration and rehabilitation projects. Please reach out to us to discuss your acquisition application before applying. The most common application activity is for rehabilitation or restoration projects. Rehabilitation or restoration work should emphasize the protection of the property and/or the repair of important original and historic features and materials. Special historical features are fun to restore, such as very fragile, hand-painted, or carved interiors that require specialized restoration work. These might be the project types primarily associated with our program, but we fund many other project types. So don't think that your project needs to be fancy or flashy to be competitive. We often fund the rehabilitation of historic wood siding, masonry work such as repointing or foundation repairs, roof repairs or replacements, structural work, and other carpentry work such as wood flooring, windows, doors, and decorative features. New construction is not eligible for funding under this grant. Although technically eligible for funding, other work items such as electrical repair, lighting, drainage or site work, plumbing, and bathroom and kitchen upgrades are not considered to be competitive. When deciding on your grant project, keep in mind the urgency of your project. An example of project urgency would be if the structure or site is imminently threatened by a severe lack of maintenance, damage, or development pressures. This is a little bit different than urgency of need, which refers to the financial ability of an applicant or organization to fund a project without MHT intervention. And other sources of funds, such as private capital or other grant programs, be used to fund, or are they currently funding the project? If so, you may not rank as highly as projects that have access to limited financial resources. The project should also be a discrete phase of work. If you're unsure that your grant project is eligible or competitive, please get in touch with us. The third category of eligible activities is pre-development. Only local governments and nonprofits are eligible for this type of grant funding. Eligible pre-development work must be necessary for construction to take place and will inform a construction project. Eligible pre-development activities include construction documents, archaeological surveys, historic structures reports, conditions assessments, structural engineering reports, architectural services, cemetery conservation plans, and more. Historical research, preservation plans, feasibility studies, and master plans are not eligible for funding through this program. In some cases, pre-development only grants are awarded, but to be a competitive application, pre-development activities would not be the only part of the grant application. It should be part of a larger construction project that will use the pre-development documents to inform and complete a construction project. There are a few other pieces of information to know about eligible projects. The goal of the grant is to fund capital-related expenditures only. Project work is expected to last at least 15 years And we can't fund work that's already started. So any work already underway is not eligible for grant funding. However, other work can be happening on your site while the grant project is underway. All projects funded by an MHT grant must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. So what are the Secretary of the Interior standards? If you aren't familiar with them, they're a set of guidelines for work on historic properties created by the National Park Service that as a state agency, MHT and our grantees are obligated to follow. Most simply put, your project must protect and retain historic features and materials. You can see from the photo on the left that the interior of the lodge was in a bad state of deterioration, but that does not mean we gut and replace with new non-historic materials or remove the stage altogether. Instead, we follow the standards to repair in kind where possible and replace the rest with appropriate materials. Without this historic stage feature, the building just wouldn't be the same. It would lose its history and its sense of place. We will help to make sure that your work meets those standards. Reach out to us if you're unsure if your proposed project will meet the standards. If you're applying for a grant for a religious property, there are a few restrictions you need to be aware of. Buildings used for religious purposes are primarily funded for exterior and structural work, with some exceptions. This is because interior spaces used for religious purposes are ineligible for funding from the state. Work on features with religious imagery, such as stained glass windows, are also not eligible for funding. Please get in touch with us to discuss your religious site if you have any questions. If you're interested, on our YouTube channel, we have a recorded webinar that covers religious sites in more detail. Our program webpage is a direct link to our YouTube channel. Cemeteries are eligible for this grant program. However, they must demonstrate an exceptional level of significance to be eligible for the NRHP. Examples of cemetery projects include the repair and resetting of markers, the identifications of burials through ground-penetrating radar or other survey methods, a cemetery conservation plan, and the repair of historic paths, walls, fences, etc. Since the program's relaunch in 2018, we've only funded one cemetery project, the Westminster Cemetery in Baltimore. The project included pre-development work, including a structural assessment that informed the construction project repairs to the iron gate, piers, and brick wall. If you have a cemetery project in mind, please get in touch with us to discuss eligibility. I've already mentioned a few ineligible costs, but I wanted to provide a few more examples of other ineligible expenditures of grant funds. These include legal fees, insurance, staff salaries, annual maintenance, temporary exhibits, landscaping, and work that is not bid per our program policy. For a more complete list of eligible and ineligible costs, it can be found in the grant guidelines, which can be accessed on our website. So throughout the presentation so far, I've been mentioning what could help make your application more competitive. I just want to clarify that there's a difference between being eligible for the grant program and having a competitive application. All applications that are considered by the review committee meet the basic eligibility requirements of the program. What sets your application apart from others is what can make it more competitive. Excelling in the most heavily weighted sections of the application, the public benefit, significance, and project description sections, will help make your application more competitive. We'll talk a little bit about these sections of the application in more detail a little bit later on. Now let's talk about how to get started on your application and specific application questions. If you haven't already, please reach out to us to check if your project meets the program eligibility requirements. My email address will be available at the end of the presentation and is also available in the grant guidelines and on our website. We hate to review applications where the applicant never reached out to us and their application is in left field or is ineligible. We recognize it does take some time to fill out these applications and want to help you make your application as successful and as competitive as possible prior to submitting. Look over the sample application and grant guidelines on the website and identify the items that will take some time to put together, such as the property owner consent letter, requesting letters of support in creating your own budget, and getting estimates. You can use letters of support from other grant programs or from last year's grant round if you are looking for funding for the exact same scope of work as outlined in the letters. Again, the letters must be signed or they cannot be counted. It may help to be aware of other state and local regulations, such as the permitting process, or if your project would need to go in front of a historic preservation or planning commission. We don't evaluate or check on these things, but you'll want to investigate these items before getting started and see what other requirements you may have to follow and how they may impact your project timeline. So what type of project do you have in mind? Is it an acquisition project? Is it rehabilitation? Think about what will be the most competitive project for your site and reach out to us to discuss. If the project is going to cost more than the maximum grant amount allowed of $100,000 or take longer than 2 years to complete, think about breaking down the project into phases. What is the highest priority of work or the most urgent area of work to focus on? Please don't ask for funding for flooring or plaster repairs if the roof is leaking and needs to be addressed first. We need to make sure we leave your property in a better state than when the project started, and that means addressing the most critical items for your project stabilization and preservation. Think about what level of preservation your project entails and does it meet the standards. We also recommend reaching out to your partners that have received a grant from us or applied to this grant program before for helping with developing your project or for help getting a good contractor estimate. If you're a church, talk to other churches about their hurdles for the permitting process or getting umbrella letters or other issues. Know what expertise the project requires and assemble a strong project team. As I mentioned before, one of the heavily weighted sections of the application is the construction project description. You will be asking the application to describe your project. Think about these tips and questions when doing so. Be clear and concise about what the project entails and about what you're going to ask grant funding to pay for. Is the work eligible and preserving a historic feature, therefore meeting the standards? Is it a discrete phase of the work? Is the work getting a project started, or is it the final phase of a larger construction project? Is the description clear enough for grant reviewers to understand? Please make sure all the work described in this section matches the line items in your budget spreadsheet, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. When putting together your project schedule, consider these questions and refer to the grant guidelines for more information. Projects that would be ready to start after an award are made are preferred and would make your application more competitive. Is the project phased? What's your own schedule? Do you need to plan around a festival or another project? Are you a wedding venue or an event space that can't afford to close during a certain time of year? Consider times for permits and design if needed, MHT approvals, easement conveyance, procurement process, etc. These all take time, so consider them in your project schedule. We expect that the project will wrap up in a 2-year period. Please know that your project won't start right away. It'll take some time to complete the grant agreements or easement conveyance processes. Now for the photos, which are very important for the application. In the application, you're going to need to provide at least 10 photos of your property and the project area or project areas. This includes providing photo captions and a brief description of the photos. We've added a photograph template to our webpage that'll help make this process easier for you. You'll just need to click the space allocated for the photograph you wish to attach, and it will allow you to upload your file, which will be automatically formatted to fit the template. Unfortunately, there isn't enough space to upload individual photos in the application itself. Be sure to provide photos that show the work described in the construction project description section. The photos should show the overall project site, as well as the specific project area or areas, and how urgent the work is. For example, the photo on the right is a great example of an overall image of the project property that provides the grant reviewer with the context of the property. However, alone, it doesn't illustrate the work that needs to be done. So the photo on the left is a close-up of a deteriorated porch and clearly shows the urgency of a project. Include an overall photo of your project for MHT to use for promotional materials and announcing awards. Another heavily weighted section of the application is historical and cultural significance. Provide a brief yet compelling narrative about the overall and inclusive history of the project property. Assume grant reviewers are not familiar with your site and paint them a picture. It's not necessary to upload your site's MIHP form or enter a National Register nomination form, since they're already available to staff. You know your site better than anyone, so tell us the historical information beyond what is provided in those types of documents. Additionally, the meaning of a place to its community can change a lot over time. Explain what the property means to the community today and how the stewardship of the site is integral to the occupant organization's mission. But please note, there's also no theme question for this grant round. So public benefit and impact. This is the most heavily weighted section of the application and where applicants tend to struggle the most. In this section, you're going to discuss the use and accessibility of the property and the public benefit of the project or the property, especially to the local community, but as it relates to MHT's mission. Applicants tend to miss the mark in this section because they focus all of their attention on their organization and what they do to meet their own mission, which is very important and relevant information, but they don't make that historic preservation connection. Unsuccessful applicants also don't have a public benefit behind or beyond their immediate congregation, staff, members, or their own personal interests. When we say public benefit, this could be through virtual programming, social media, brochures, holding architectural lectures, offering event or office space to other organizations, partnerships, walking tours, hosting field trips. The possibilities really are endless. The benefit does not have to be in action right now and can be in the planning stages. However, at least some steps toward developing the benefit should be shown in order to be competitive. Interpretive and educational benefits that focus on sharing stories of underrepresented communities will also be more competitive. Now let's focus on what to provide in your application budget. You can't create a budget without knowing what your project scope of work will be. So going back when we talked about the construction project description section, this is where you're going to talk about your entire construction project, even work that grant funds aren't being requested for. The work you are requesting grants funds for should be listed under the grant project scope of work question that you see in the right column. This is what should match the line items in your budget spreadsheet. You can see here an example of a sample project scope of work versus the construction project description. To help develop your budget, we recommend getting one or more rough estimates for the grant project scope of work. One estimate is sufficient for the application, and they're typically free. From there, you'll be able to identify project priorities and if there are other funding resources you may need to put toward the project. Decide if your organization can manage the project or if a project manager is needed to help successfully execute the project. If that's the case, in your budget, you're going to want to include a line item for someone to oversee the project for you. This can also be an estimate received from an architect or a general contractor. All applicants, except for nonprofit organizations, are required to provide a one-to-one match. This can be cash or it can be an in-kind match, but the match must be directly related to the grant project. A list of eligible and ineligible examples of matching funds are found in our grant guidelines. Most importantly, other state funds cannot be used as a match. The match must be funded through private capital or non-state grants. If you would like to learn more about the match requirement, a recorded webinar on match requirements can be found on MHT's YouTube channel and the slide deck on our webpage. So here's an image of the budget spreadsheet that you're going to fill out for your project. Please upload your project budget spreadsheet to the application as an Excel file only. Do not add it as a PDF or another file format. Additionally, don't include the sample budget instruction pages in your application, just your project budget. A budget template can be found on our webpage. So the column for the work item should be filled out with the specific scope item noted in your grant project scope of work. The capital funds requested column should be completed using the amount of funding that the specific grant will pay for each scope item. For instance, if repointing masonry is a scope item noted in your work item description, this column should note how much of the requested MHT grant funding will be used to repoint your masonry. The applicant proposed cash and in-kind match columns should note how much of the required cash or in-kind match will be used to help complete that specific scope item. The other project funds column should list any other funds that are not MHT funding or the cash or in-kind match that will help pay for the specific scope item. The total project funds column will be the sum of the previous three columns. The template will automatically total the project costs at the bottom of the spreadsheet and the total project funds column. In this section, we'll discuss the grant administration schedule, grant paperwork, and conveying an easement. The application is available on our website beginning February 3rd and is due at 11:59 p.m. on March 17th. By June, we anticipate announcing grant awards and issuing grant agreements, but since we're working with a 2-year timeline, the anticipated grant project completion date is June of 2027. It takes time to complete grant paperwork and convey an easement, so work will not start right away. Funds are also not dispersed until the easement has been conveyed. Another important program requirement to note is the conveyance of a preservation easement to MHT if a grant award is accepted. This is a regulatory requirement of the program and is mandatory for all historic preservation capital program awardees. So what is an easement? A preservation easement is a legal contract between MHT and the property owner. The easement is recorded in the local land records and stays with the property for a set amount of time. The easement helps protect buildings, structures, and associated archaeological resources on the property. It requires MHT approval of any physical work on your property before it begins. The easement boundaries and areas of the building that the easement will protect are determined by MHT easement staff. The owner must notify MHT of any proposed changes to the property within the easement boundary for approval before the work is undertaken. The request will be reviewed by MHT easement staff and may include additional review from the MHT easement committee. The owner must maintain the property in good condition. This includes making sure that the current architectural or archaeological features remain intact and that any deterioration or damage is addressed. Please note that insurance may be required to convey an easement, but it cannot be covered as a cost by the grants. It has to be handled by a different type of funding source. As far as the application goes, include the property owner consent letter to prove that the property owner agrees to the project and the conveyance of the easement to MHT. Since the easements must be conveyed before work begins or before grant funds are dispersed, it may add to your timeline. Legal fees related to drafting the easement are not eligible for grant funds or as a match. A previously recorded webinar about easements can be found on MHT's YouTube channel, and webinar slides are on our website. So a few other things to think about. If you are awarded a grant, all work must be approved by MHT before construction begins. Grant funds can only pay for contractors hired through a procurement process approved by MHT, and MHT can only pay the grantee directly, who is then responsible for paying the contractor. Any work performed without going through this procurement process will not be funded by the grant. You can reach out to us over what the procurement process entails, and we're always happy to help you develop a request for proposal or with reaching out to qualified tradespeople. So we'll wrap up with the selection process and the grant selection criteria. After the deadline date of March 17th, these are the steps that MHT are going to take. Staff will review the applications and confirm eligibility. The grant review committee ranks and reviews the application. MHT board and the secretary will review recommendations by the grant review committee. The secretary will make a final approval, and award notifications are emailed by June. If you haven't heard from us by July, feel free to reach out in case your email got lost. But if you haven't heard from us, that likely means that we don't have an approval list from the secretary yet. Multiple selection criteria will be used to rank your application. There is more information in the grant guidelines about how the criteria are considered for each section of the application. Again, the most heavily weighted sections are significance, public benefit, and project description sections. I know that this is a ton of information, so thank you for sticking with us through this webinar. Here's my email address and number so you can get in touch with me, as well as a link to the program website. I hope that you all have a good day. Thank you.